Hey y'all, and welcome back to another video of My Creative Life with Kel Sweetie, where we read books and we make art. We are going over my November TBR as well as my October wrap-up. That was out of order, but we're moving with it. We are going over both of those. This last month, I read 6 books. Now, for some booktubers, that's a weekend. For me, that's doing a lot because I usually average anywhere from 3 to 4 books. And last month was an amazing month, which also makes sense. Horror is a national, October is the horror bonanza. Like, that's when I should be reading as much horror as I possibly can. And coming off of, I don't want to call it a slump, but it was slumpy. It was getting real messy. I was not reading very much. I was not really choosing a lot of books that were fantastic. Last month was a real saver. I had 2 other books that were on my TBR that I did not finish. And then I added 2 books to my TBR that I originally wasn't going to read. So it all shook out. Let's go over my wrap up, because it's going to be a long one, and my TBR for November, which I'll be focusing on Indigenous authors and stories all month. So let's get into it. Like I said in the intro, October was surprisingly a very great month for me reading-wise. I usually don't read this many books. Like, I don't read 6 books a month. And I think that has to do with the fact that, one, I was reading what was available. I was not sitting here and just trying to make sure that it was on topic and on theme. I think I need to be more conscientious and take advantage of that during months where a heritage or culture isn't necessarily being celebrated. Something to keep in mind. I didn't do that during August, which was a free month for me. And it's something to keep in mind in January, which will be like more of a free month. I think I get like 3 free months a year, and where I'm not celebrating necessarily a heritage or a culture, something that I love to do here and how I like to read in order to diversify my shelves. And I think taking advantage of those months and reading whatever is available for me to kind of kick up that number for my yearly goal, which I am nearing as many books as I read last year. And I have a special video planned for that when I finally hit it. Hopefully it'll be sometime midway through this month, but it may be at the top of next month. We are going to be cutting it really close because I know that I'm really behind, and I don't think it's very likely I'll hit my yearly goal, which was 65 books, which was already doing a lot because I read 52 last year. And I was like, shoot for the stars. Why not? I may just end up hitting 60, which is still more than I read last year, which is always the goal. So, slowly but surely. Let's start off with my October wrap-up. I started off the month reading The Exorcist. I saved this all year to read. I have never read The Exorcist. I've never watched The Exorcist. And I was like, okay, I'm going to read it finally this year because I kept on hearing from so many people that their favorite horror novel ever was The Exorcist. And I was tired of being out the loop. When they released this special cover, I was so happy that I saved it for October because I don't think that I could have gotten the normal cover. I wouldn't have wanted any other cover. I would have had doubles of The Exorcist, especially considering this one was cheaper than the original. So I was so happy. I've influenced so many people to buy this cover. If there was ever a question about influence on my Instagram, it should be gone now because so many people bought this because I posted it, because it's an amazing cover. This is amazing. So anyways, about the actual novel, I was very surprised by this. I was not expecting a lot because of when it was written. I was not really, and it was written by a man. It's about a young girl and a single mother. So I was already out the gate going, this is going to be dated. I don't feel like it was dated. I honestly feel like it was ahead of the curve. Lady really wrote a mother who felt realistic. Chris felt very realistic as a mother who is simply trying to get the help that her daughter deserves. And she is sick and tired of hearing from so many individuals that, no, she's crazy. And she's like, no, I know my daughter. She's not crazy. And even if she is, like, just help her. Like, you guys aren't helping her. I feel like when you're watching, like, a movie, a horror film, or reading a book, I feel like the mothers or the female character is always just this wilting flower in the face of this evil that's around her. And Chris never felt that way. She felt like a badass mom who was just like, I'm trying to get my daughter fixed. I'm trying to help her. And nobody's helping me. And she's screaming at people, you're not helping me. She's letting people know she's not just simply being polite about it. There's nothing polite about being possessed. So I feel like Chris was a single mom. She sat there, and her deadbeat ex-husband, she made it known she wasn't just, let me be nice just to be nice. She had parties, she drank, she was an actress, she smoked. Like, I felt she felt modern to me as a woman and as a mother, which is really saying something considering this was 1971, which I think is really, really impressive. I really loved that. I loved that all of the priests, Father Karras especially, didn't feel like, none of these people felt like stereotypes in who they were. I talk about it a lot as I was reading it in my vlogs from last month, so I won't go too far into detail because I will go on and on about how much I love the character development in this book. But Father Karras didn't feel like a caricature of a priest. I feel like a lot of people forget that these people are people, that priests are people. They think as soon as they put on that cloth, as soon as they go and they become this person, like, it's a job description. It is not who they are. They are people. And I love that all of the characters in this book didn't feel like they were caricatures of their jobs or who they were as people. So it was very easy to read. I blew through it because I was invested in the storyline. I watched the movie and I wasn't as impressed. I felt like the movie definitely Chris was still a bit of a hard ass, but she felt very, very feminine sometimes in ways that she didn't turn off. Like, she didn't feel that way in the book. I felt like Father Karras also did not, there were parts of it that just did not I also didn't think that the casting was really great on Father Karras, so I also didn't feel like there were moments where he really read for me. They also kind of inserted this queer storyline between Father Karras and another priest that I was like, that wasn't in the book. And I'm all for, like, obviously, queer storylines, but, like, what? So that was a little strange, and the ending was a little different. So, I don't know. I wasn't big on the movie, but I read this. I had Roxanne from Bye Bun here on YouTube ended up reading it as well for my recommendation, and she said she wasn't really impressed because she had watched the movie, and when she read the book, she was like, yeah, it was cool. So I think that it matters which one you watch or read first on what's going to influence you. Because especially with this being such an iconic story. So I ended up rating this, I want to say 4.5. I don't think it was a 5, but I think it was very close to 1. But I had a great time reading this one. The next book that I read was actually sent to me by a publisher, Akashic Books, and it was The Wishing Pool and Other Stories by Tananarive. This one, I believe, is a re-release. It wasn't released this year. I'm not really certain as to why I was sent it, since it wasn't necessarily an arc. I just feel like this has been out. Yeah, it was published in 2023 originally and re-released this year. I loved it, though. I don't think that, I judge books by the cover, how I pick them up. And while Tananarive, I read My Soul to Keep, and I did not really love it. I did not really care for the male character or the female character in that storyline, and I haven't really picked up Tananarive since. This has given me life to pick up another one of her novels. These stories are a collection of stories, and I felt like each one had their own personality, which I absolutely loved. Sometimes reading a collection of short stories by an author can get a little redundant because they get in a vibe and they sit down and they write one and then start up another one and they're still in the same mindset. None of these felt like they were sisters or brothers to either one. Actually, there's only 2 or 3 in here that are like sequels of each other. And I felt like those were kind of the ones that were the letdowns of the book. So, and I think that was again because of running one into the other. There were, I mean, I think the one that was in here that was, and I have a comprehensive breakdown and review on my Instagram where I rate basically story to story which ones I loved. I like doing that with these short stories and anthologies. I like to kind of give an overall review of the book and then a review of each story within the book. But one of my favorites was Caretaker. Something about that felt so eerie, and it has to do with ants and a baby and spirits that make no sense, and something, it just made you feel unsettled. I mean, it's still a very scary novel because you don't really know what happened, but hearing what was happening and it starting off like this police report about what happened with a child who was left alone for days on end but was taken care of somehow. I'm visualizing what's being written, and it feels very Skinamarink. Like it feels very, what is that? That's weird type of thing. I can't explain it without really giving away what happens in the story, but I absolutely loved Caretaker as well as Last Stop on Route 9. I felt like that was a really, really great ghost story that felt absolutely, absolutely creepy. Even the wishing pool, which starts off the entire novel, I felt like was a really good one and very metaphoric of our parents and their lives before they have children and everything. Absolutely love this. Was so happy that Akashic sent this to me. I really don't think I would have picked it up beforehand had I not, and now I'm constantly recommending this to so many people to pick up if they're looking for a short story collection or if they're looking for a gateway to Tananarive, because I feel like people recommend My Soul to Keep. They shouldn't be recommending that as the first Tananarive that they read, and I don't also think that everybody should just jump into the reformatory, because I just feel like that's such a, like, this is how she got big off of this, but like a more well-known name, but she's been writing forever and making classics forever. So I don't know. I highly recommend you to check this out, especially if you're into speculative fiction and not just simply horror, but something that's a little bit more sci-fi in a way. I highly recommend this. And also coming off of reading The Exorcist and then reading a story like, what was it? Attachment or no, it wasn't. It was called Migration. It was Migration. Migration, coming off of reading The Exorcist, it was really, really great. That was another great one because it felt like if Reagan had never gotten the devil out of her and instead they decided to cohabitate within that body, what that would have kind of looked like. Really love that story. So I highly recommend you to check this out, especially if you're searching for some short stories to pick up. The Wishing Pool is really, really great. In between that one and my next, and Model Home, I was still waiting for Model Home to come off of Libby, off of the hold, and I needed to read something because it was saying that I had like 2 more weeks before I was going to be able to read that. The problem is that I didn't have 2 weeks to give. And I need audiobooks because I was busy. That's another reason why I read so many audiobooks. I'm just doing so much all the time that it's really better for me to just listen rather than to read, because as I'll talk about in just a moment, when I physically read, it just isn't going to happen. I don't have a lot of time to just sit down and physically read. So I had to look through my TBR shelves and see if I had any novellas, because I needed something that was also a quick layup because I'm so behind on my reading goal. And You Should Have Left was available. It's only 3 hours on audio, and I honestly really liked it. I mean, it's not like, oh my god, this changed my brain chemistry, as I'm always saying. But I did like it because I personally really love the experience of reading House of Leaves. And while I love the experience of reading that book, I know that's a lot for people. And it's also a lot for somebody to try and dive into and not know what they're getting into. I recommend now to read You Should Have Left if you are thinking of reading House of Leaves. It's kind of like a crash course on the vibes you'll probably get from House of Leaves. If you are not a fan of all vibes, no plot, then don't read House of Leaves. And this is all vibes, no plot. It has to do with kind of this space that feels is untrustworthy, kind of this wintry aspect, a male figure who is sitting there and depressive and this that very very masculine, I'm a father and I'm a husband but I don't know what else I am anymore type of figure. That's all in this. But I feel like with it being a novella, I appreciated it more than if it was a full-length novel. If this was full-length, I have a feeling that I wouldn't have really liked it as much. I think it would have drawn on too long, especially with who the main character is. But with it being a novella, I think that I really appreciated it, feeling like it was very eerie and in a space that I couldn't trust, and very creepy in a way. So I do recommend this book. It was highly recommended to me. I don't know if I would highly recommend it, but I do think that if you have some time, this you could knock out in one sitting if you're reading it physically. And if you're not, the audiobook, it said 3 hours. I think I knocked it out in maybe 2.5, maybe 2. It really wasn't that long, and I feel like it was a payoff for the time I invested in it. My next read was Model Home by River Solomon. Everyone in the world has been reading this book, mainly because of the gorgeous cover. Get into that cover, people. Who said that lime green doesn't sell? What's wrong? Love, love, love this cover. As now the designer that I am, these are the type of covers that I absolutely am in love with. And the book is something that I don't think a lot of people were expecting for it to be. It's sold as a haunted house horror. And it is that. But as a River Solomon book is, it is far more than that and 5 million other stories. Our main character, what was their name? Esri. Esri is not likable, very, very destructive, not a great parent, didn't really want to be a parent. And the family dynamic is messy and not in a way that's very comfortable. But what I loved about this novel is that it really talked more about that feeling of when you get older and you realize your family and your parents are simply human and that they're also responsible for dealing with their emotions, not simply you responding to their emotions. I love that. As somebody who's dealing with that in their own family dynamic right now, I really loved how much this talked about trauma and what happens when you do not heal your trauma. You simply try and forget your trauma. And it goes back to that conversation, and I talk about this again in one of my vlogs more in depth, but it talks about the idea of people love to say, you need to let something go. And the thing is that letting go of something has to be coupled with healing from something, dealing with that trauma and healing from it, not simply going, it didn't happen. Because it happened. It formed who you are, and it's informing who you are until you learn from it, until you heal from it. This book is about the concept of that if you don't deal with it, if you don't deal with those traumas, if you don't talk about trauma, especially like as a Black woman coming from a family, we are people of color and families of color are known for simply experiencing trauma and coping with the trauma, not healing from it. And we don't realize that we're doing that because of centuries of having so much trauma within our ancestorship, within our history, and not even having the opportunity to heal from it. So we just learn to cope. And so what's happening right now, and what I think is really interesting, is that a lot of families and a lot of millennials are going to therapy, and we're trying to learn how to heal from our trauma, and our families are not in that same space to learn from it. So that's where a book like this comes into mind, where it's a conversation of we have to learn. While we had to cope before, we didn't have any room, we didn't have the option to heal before. We now do, and we now have to start doing those things because it's informed the trauma within our families. Love this book. Absolutely, absolutely loved it. I think what will kind of make you kind of have a moment is realizing what the actual haunting in the house is. I think because of the way that this was marketed, it was marketed as a true haunted house horror story. And it's not exactly that. So you're going to spend a good portion of the book waiting for that moment to happen. And when it doesn't, you're going to be kind of like, wait, okay, I gotta catch up. I gotta catch up here because my mind was saying that this entire book was one thing and it's actually something else. But I absolutely loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Can't recommend it enough, even if it's just for the cover. The next book that I finished was another one that I had been saving all year for, and that was Silence of the Lambs. I picked up this great paperback. Again, let's get into it. I picked up this great, fantastic paperback from the thrift store earlier this year, and I couldn't leave it there. I'd been wanting to read Silence of the Lambs. This is like the ABCs of horror. And so I saved it until Halloween, and I knew I wanted to read it. I really did love this book. I've watched the movie. I like the movie a whole lot. I do have feelings towards the movie, and those feelings were kind of set aside once I finally read the book. I think the movie lets the book down. The movie, although it mentions here and there that Buffalo Bill is not transgender, it doesn't do a good job of explaining that very much, and they only mention it once. So in retrospect, the movie ends up demonizing transgender, drag, lifestyle, all of that by not really going into depth about what Buffalo Bill actually is mentally. Whereas the book does. The book goes into that many times, and many times it actually sits there and it straight up tells you, you know, there are doctors in here that are like, that give affirming care who are like, I don't want you sniffing around this hospital. I don't want you to, you know, investigating what we do here, because inevitably you are going to demonize what we do here, which is affirming people in their gender, affirming people in their lives. And it talks about that in depth in this book. It also talks about Buffalo Bill and his thought process on why he's building this bodysuit. And it's not simply because he feels this gender dysphoria, but rather he feels dysphoric to society. And that has nothing to do with how he recognizes himself gender-wise. It instead has to do more so with his mental. He feels at odds with society mentally, and he assumes that it is because he feels at odds and he must be queer. He must be, there's something wrong with me. And it is. There is something wrong with you. And it's not your gender, not how you recognize yourself. I loved that the book went into that. I love that the book actually talked about that, and it made a clear distinction that what this book was. And it was not to demonize transgender. Or transgender affirming care or any of that. So I love that. I loved that it's clear that Clarice is queer in this book. There are many, many situations where her sexuality is brought up, and her reactions to those situations make it very clear that she is queer. In the movie, we can only really assume. There's not really a lot in regards to that. And I also like how Hannibal is treated more as a human rather than this omnipresence. It talks more about how he knows that about Buffalo Bill so much, and what he's doing, and why he's doing some of the things that he's doing, why he has those answers. In the movie, I don't think they go over it. It just seems like he's omnipresent. Like, how do you know that this is what Bill's going to do, this, that, and the third? And it seems more also in here that Hannibal Lecter is a sociopath, very egotistical, very much wanting to be in control of the situation. Whereas in the movie, I think they do a better job of trying to cover that up. So he just feels more psychopathic than sociopathic. And in this book, it's very clear that he is ran by ego. Most definitely, the ego is first and foremost throughout all of this. It also feels more like a mystery crime novel. The movie focuses so much on Hannibal eating faces and the horrors that Buffalo Bill is doing, that it doesn't really get into the fact that this is an FBI crime novel. If you love All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby, you will love the Silence of the Lambs. I feel like this is the blueprint to what S.A. Cosby wrote as far as All the Sinners Bleed. I really, really recommend it. The only thing that I hate about this novel, and I feel like it has to do more with the outdatedness of when it was written than the actual novelist, but, you know, whatever. It is fatphobic. Most certainly fatphobic. If you have any sort of issues with body dysmorphia heavily, and you have issues in regards to your body image, I don't necessarily recommend it. There are many times where girls who are attacked in this book are, they straight up call them fat. It's not chubby or thick or whatever. They call them fat. They're 14s. They're size 14s, which, as a lot of people know now, is the average size of many people, let alone Americans. I am a size 14. So according to this book, I am obese and fat. I would be attacked. Well, I probably wouldn't because of my skin, but you know what I mean. They're called fat, and I think that that's completely tone deaf for reading it now. This is, of course, is the 80s, and eating disorders are running rampant during this time, more than probably any other decade. So it's clear as to when this was written. But just to keep that in mind as a trigger warning, I think is the is the most like forward one that I could probably give you, that it's pretty fat phobic. I gave this around a 4.5 because it was still an amazing reading experience. I think that Clarice, also shout out to the casting director for Silence of the Lambs, because Clarice was casted perfectly. The entire time I was like, that's Jodie Foster. Absolutely. I do recommend it. Give it a try. The last book that I read in October was World War Z. I was not expecting to read this novel. I wasn't even expecting to really pick it up. I found it while thrifting for a really cheap price, and I've been wanting to read it for quite some time. So I decided to pick it up. It was really cheap. And I had time near the end of the month because of two of the novels that I'm about to get into. I wasn't finished reading, and I needed something that was an audiobook that I could listen to while I was working on what ended up being a mad dash run on my Night Terror magazine illustrations, and that ended up being this novel. I was pleasantly surprised, though. I wouldn't have really guessed that this would have been a novel that I was really excited to read at all. I wasn't necessarily like, oh, I need to read this immediately. I know that I'd seen this a lot everywhere. I'd seen the movie when it first came out with Brad Pitt, and I hadn't seen the movie since. And so I just decided, okay, fine, this is available on Libby. All of my TBR books seem to not be available on Libby for some reason, but this was. It wasn't that long of a read, and so I ended up picking it up. I'm so glad I did. One, it has a full cast. I also recommend that you read the version that doesn't have the Brad Pitt abridged version, that you should only read the original version that came out, that is much shorter and is written more like a first-person collection of what happened during World War Z. So for you to kind of understand what was happening and what the original book was supposed to be was more of an, like it says, an oral history, but a book that was to talk about everyone who survived after World War Z had happened. What was going on during World War Z, and how did we push back against the zombies? How did we end up, quote unquote, winning that war? It kind of looms at the end that it's not necessarily fully won, zombies aren't eradicated, but that we've pushed back enough for us to get back to our lives. What I loved about this is that it was this is more of an anthropological look at society and how we in politics are, and how we as a world would be if faced with an impending doom, basically extinction. That society would change all of it. Like, I loved, I loved how it was, if you were working an office job and it was very white collar, you are high up on the chain, you're a lawyer for entertainment, you work in the music business and stuff. Once the zombie like war happened, your job was not necessary anymore. It went straight back to World War II when everybody was asked to pitch in order to win. And the same thing happened here. People who were in those white collar positions had to get training by blue collar professionals, people that had trade jobs, in order to learn how to be of service to the world, because the world needed their service. And how people dealt with that, how people dealt with conversations of food loss, how they were dealing with that. That, you know, the Army and the Air Force were no longer dropping off rations, but instead dropping off supplies for people to fish to hunt, training people to do those things because you weren't able to just work in factories and do, what we were doing before. How cities that were, LA or New York or just high population cities were completely flattened overnight because of the war that was going on. How war tactics had to change, how the landscape of what a soldier looked like anymore. Armies weren't just filled with, machismo men anymore or hypermasculated men. It was filled with, people who were strong of mind. I love that there was a soldier doing an interview in here, and he would refer to some people who were in his platoon and in his squad, and he would say, yeah, Miss Johnson, or whatever. Miss Johnson was a 50-year-old nun who had held off zombies surrounding a Sunday school, church, or whatever for some years and then decided to volunteer and be a part of the army because of it. I love that idea because that's exactly what was going to be necessary to fight off the zombies. And they talk about that. They talk about how it wasn't what was your hand-to-hand combat because you were hoping that it didn't lead to you being upfront with the zombie. Instead, it was what was your mental strength to deal with just shooting all day because it was swarms. You were no longer working towards an enemy where it was intelligence, but instead of just feral energy. It talked about how politics had to change, how politicians had to change. But at the same time, it talked about how logical decisions weren't being made because we were still people with our self-interest in mind. And that's what happens, unfortunately, during these moments of war. We would love to think that logic prevails and people are just like, okay, we have to do this in order to do this. But emotion is a human concept. It is part of humanity. And those emotional charges are some of our downfalls and how they incorporate into politics and something like this that would be happening. How Cuba became democratic almost overnight because everybody fled to Cuba. It was very, very interesting hearing the interview by a Cuban who was talking about where it had changed. Some of my favorite quotes about politics came from this book. I also loved how there were plenty of international interviews. It didn't just simply talk about America and what was happening in America, which having an American author, I think that was very easy to happen because it happens very often, even in World War Z, the movie. While there is a scene that happens in Israel, it's not necessarily talking about the world struggle of what's happening and the world reaction to what's happening. I also am not, after I read this, I watched the film, which that was probably my second time ever watching the film. And of course they changed the scenes that happen in Israel. So I appreciated that they actually interviewed a Palestinian in this book. And he talks very clearly about Zionism and Israel and Gaza and this worry that was happening because Israel ended up quarantining the area in Palestine more than anybody else in the world, and they got ahead of it. And that a lot of Palestinians were concerned because they weren't really telling them why they were quarantining, and they were concerned that honestly what's happening right now, the genocide happening in Palestine, was happening then. This was written in, I want to say 2013. No, it was written 2006. That's when this was published. That goes to show you and prove that, what's happening right now in Palestine didn't just happen overnight. It didn't just happen in the last year. This is something that's been going on for a very long time. And the way that it's spoken about in this book, the politics of it all, it's very interesting. And it talks about the apartheid in South Africa, and it talks about that in depth. I really, really loved how it really kind of talked about those situations. It talked about the world at large and how the world's politics affected how it was reacted in this zombie apocalypse, not just what was America's thought process. And when I watched the movie, I was disappointed because unfortunately a lot of those scenes as far as South Africa and Cuba and all these other locations were completely taken out. And the scene in regards to Palestine and Israel it had no context. You had a portion where those who was Israeli and those who were Palestinian were singing together, but you had no context, especially as an American. Unfortunately, as Americans, we're extremely ignorant to what was happening, especially at that time when the movie released in 2013. There was no real reference as to why it was important or crazy that, they were all celebrating together. There was no context to that. And also, there was no context to the fact of the Israeli army that was there on occupation. There was no conversation whatsoever of the Palestinians and why they may have been fearful to even move forward with what they were doing. The conversations of a wall were touched on here and there, but again, there was no context, especially for an American audience that didn't understand the politics at that time and just now are understanding some of the politics because of what's happening in Palestine. I think that the book did an amazing job, and I think, honestly, the book aged extremely well. I think even right now, I could recommend this to somebody and would actually recommend it more now than I would have, before everything in Gaza happened. So I do recommend you to pick up World War Z. I recommend, though, you to pick up the abridged version. I do not recommend you to pick up the version that has the Brad Pitt story in it. I don't think the Brad Pitt story does really anything and I'm not planning on reading. I have the unabridged version. This was the original version that came out that didn't have all of that in there. And I really don't feel like I was missing out on anything. I think, honestly, having a actual plot-driven story within the book would have ruined it for me because it felt more anthropological, like as a worldwide society was concerned, rather than this plot-driven, we're just looking at this one guy. Plus, I watched that movie and I was so irritated by the end of it because the wife was stupid. Honestly, I would have been happy if she was eaten. And the daughters were also, stupid. There was no discernment whatsoever. Brad Pitt deserved better as a family. They got a lot of men killed and a lot of people killed because they just simply did not understand where they were, that the world had gone completely flat overnight. And they still were acting like they were still in society. What? That could be a whole other movie all of its own, but a whole other video all of its own. But I do recommend the original version, and I do recommend you to listen to the audiobook because it is a full cast and it does feel like you're hearing, real people talk about what happened. And I think it's a great look at the world as a whole and what we're dealing with politics wise, and how we would deal with something like this, let alone how we deal with plenty of different politics and how we deal with war. What is strategy? These were all things that were brought up in this book, and it made it enjoyable for me to read because I'm not usually one to pick up any sort of book like that. But this definitely made it enjoyable. Absolutely loved it. Highly recommend it. This was my last official read of October. I will talk quickly about the ones that I did not get to, but they were on my TBR. So 2 books that were originally on my TBR and I did not get to because they were physical reads were Slewfoot and American Psycho. I did not even touch American Psycho. It needed to be a physical read and I never got to it. I honestly am not sure when I'll get to it because it's a physical read. I found out that there is an audiobook, but it is only on Audible, and it's an Audible exclusive, and I'm just not paying month to month when I have Libby available. There will be probably some time during a Christmas vacation or maybe a 24-hour read-a-thon. I really do want to do a 24-hour read-a-thon before the end of the year, before we really get into the holiday season and I have family over, just to knock out as many books physically as I can. We will see if I get to that, but I really want to try and do it. Didn't even touch it. So there's that. I did get to a portion of Slewfoot. So the audiobook released by the end of the month, and I got through some of the audiobook. I had only read a portion of the physical. I didn't get through too much. I'm considering setting it aside. Not DNFing, but setting it aside for the time being. I'm just not that interested in it. So many people said, read Slewfoot, it's so great. And it's not even that it's a bad novel. I don't think that it's not necessarily good. I'm just truly not very much interested in Puritan witch stories. I think a lot of people like it. And for me personally, I read Magic Lessons and I DNF'd it because I was so bored. I just really don't care about Puritan witch stories at all. I don't really care for Puritan stories, period. There's certain, it just feels extremely outdated. It's extremely outdated and extremely European. There have been plenty of situations where these people are talking and they say things like savages in regards to talking about indigenous folks, and it's just kind of like, I get the time period, but it kind of makes me removed from the story, where I'm just like, I really don't like I don't really care. There are, of course, this is about a witch and the devil, and there are very interesting locations visually, writing wise, but as far as like the actual conversation within this, it feels extremely outdated. As far as the community at large, I've talked to some people who've read the book, and they do kind of agree. They say like it's good, but if you're looking for something a little bit more modern, this isn't the book for you. And I think that I should say that here, because I think that this book has been recommended to death. Everybody in the world is like, read Slewfoot, read it. And unfortunately, I just kind of feel like it doesn't, it's perfect for the time period. It's written beautifully. That all of that is 5 stars. But if you are going to pick up this book, I do recommend that you take a good look at whether or not you want to read about a Puritan witch. If you don't, you really don't want to pick up this book. It's not going to be written like modernly, and it just so happens that we're in the Puritan like witch hunt era. It is absolutely Salem witch trials to its core. I've heard that at the end it gets pretty crazy, and a part of me wants to figure out what that is. And of course, I hate DNFing books, especially ones that I've spent time on, because I've spent time on them. But I really want to get to my November TBR, and I've kind of started it already, and I just don't see myself coming back to this right now. I want to set it aside because I do want to finish it, but I don't know. We'll see. I really wanted it because, of course, it just has so much beautiful imagery in it. I don't know. I think that maybe I should read Evil in Me by Brom instead, since that takes place much more modern time, and see if maybe that I'm more attracted to, because this is kind of boring me. So, sorry for anybody who's a huge Slewfoot fan. I just, personally, I'm not really connecting with the story very much. Abatha's alright. I'm upset about Edward. Edward seemed like the nicest guy, so I don't know. We'll see. But for right now, we're going to set this aside, even though I have the audiobook finally. I'm kind of waiting for the loan to zero out, because I think there's a possibility that one day that I'll just go, okay, let's just shoot through it. But I don't want to do that and then end up in a slump. I've committed too much time to this. Let's move on to my November TBR, because I'm upset that I didn't finish this and that I'm feeling the way I'm feeling about it right now. Okay, so as I mentioned before, November is Indigenous Heritage Month, and I really want to lean into that this month because, in all honesty, I realized while making the recommendations for this month's Night Terror magazine issue, I've not read any Indigenous horror at all, which is disgraceful. And I'm trying to read more than just Stephen Graham Jones, because everybody loves Stephen Graham Jones. He's like the Stephen King, the Jordan Peele, the fill in the blank of Indigenous horror. And I'm positive, sure, I still need to read some of his work, but I do want to try and fit in some things that are a little less known. And I've been scrambling around trying to find some stuff that's not Stephen Graham Jones, and I have found a little bit of a list. Now, I've started off already, and I'm about 43% of the way into Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. So far, it's been good. Very atmospheric. I'm kind of sitting here wondering how the ending will be. But it's sitting in around 3 territory right now. So, enjoying it. But we will see where it goes from here. Now, that being said, I also know that Bad Cree is like one of the top Indigenous horror novels that's come out in the last year or two. Like, a lot of people give that recommendation. So again, I was trying to find more indie or lesser known indigenous authors, and I wasn't doing that amazing. I would love for y'all to give me any recommendations y'all may have down in the comments, so to add them maybe to my TBR and see if they're available. The other thing is also audiobook. I have on my TBR Tiffany Morris's Green Fuse Burning. Surprise, surprise, we'll be interviewing her for this month's Night Terror magazine, which I am super excited about because that's really crazy. Green Fuse Burning was a huge talk earlier this year. At the end of last year, a lot of people were reading her novel. I'm going to try and read it because unfortunately it is not available on audiobook and it will have to be a physical read. As we know, I'm not good at the physical reading, especially being so busy. But I am going to try my absolute best to try and knock it out. I know that it's more of a novella, so we'll see where it goes from there. But that's also on my TBR. I also have Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead, and this is a novel that I'm interested in reading as well. Johnny Appleseed. Off the reserve and trying to find ways to live and love in the big city, Johnny becomes a cyber sex worker who fetishizes himself in order to make a living. Self-ordained as an Indian glitter princess, Johnny has 1 week before he must return to the res in his former life to attend the funeral of his stepfather. The 7 days that follow are like a fevered dream. Stories of love, trauma, sex, kinship, ambition, and the heartbreaking recollection of his beloved Kokum, grandmother. Johnny's life is a series of breakages, appendages, and linkages, and as he goes through the motions of preparing to return home, he learns how to put together the pieces of his life. Johnny Appleseed is a unique, shattering vision of First Nations life full of grit, glitter, and dreams. I'm very excited to read this, mainly because it is written by Joshua Whitehead, who is Two-Spirit, as well as First Nation, and I think that that is going to be an extremely interesting story to read. Also, of course, it's a queer story about breaking and rebirth, and as we've learned from my recommendations, I love that type of storyline. It's also a shorter one, so I'm very much looking forward to knocking this one out next after reading Bad Cree. I've had this on my TBR for a little while now, saving it up for November, and I'm super excited. Also, the cover of this is amazing, so once I read it, I'm hoping that I'm absolutely in love with it so I can go out and buy the book. I know that's a very, very selfish thing to do, but I am so excited to knock this out and read it. The next one that I also have on my TBR is And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This one also has been on my list for quite some time. I've been stocking these up all year in an effort to read this during November. This one is a mind-bending, razor-sharp look at motherhood. Y'all know I love mother horror. And mental health that follows a young Indigenous woman who discovers the picture-perfect life she always hoped for may have horrifying consequences. On the surface, Alice is exactly where she thinks she should be. She's just given birth to a beautiful baby girl, Dawn. Her charming husband, Steve, a white academic whose area of study is conveniently her own Mohawk culture, is nothing but supportive, and they've moved into a new home in a posh Toronto neighborhood. But Alice cannot feel like more of an imposter. She isn't connecting with her daughter, a struggle made even more difficult by the recent loss of her own mother, and every waking moment is spent hiding her despair from Steve and their ever-watchful neighbors, among whom she's the sole Indigenous resident. Even when she does have a minute to herself, her perpetual self-doubt hinders the one vestige of her old life she has left. Her goal of writing a modern retelling of the Handuinsi Haudenosaunee. Haudenosaunee. Oh my gosh, I have to look that up. Hold on a minute. We're gonna say that correctly. Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee. Oh, I was completely off of that. Haudenosaunee. Creation story. Then, as if it all wasn't enough, strange things start to happen. She finds herself losing bits of time and hearing voices she can't explain, all while her neighbor's passive-aggressive behavior begins to morph into something far more threatening. Though Steve assures her that this is all in her head, Alice cannot fight the feeling that something is very, very wrong, and that in her creation story lies the key to her and Dawn's survival. She just has to finish it before it's too late. Again, another one that seems absolutely amazing and up my alley. So I want to read both of those back to back. And then I have 2 Stephen Graham Jones books. One that's a novella, and one that is his recent release, which was I Was a Teenage Slasher. I know that a lot of people read this and were not as impressed as My Heart is a Chainsaw, which I also have. We'll see if I end up reading it during November. I may just end up reading it during just December as I'm trying to beat the timeline. But I wanted to, I mean, it was available. And I think that it's an interesting premise, and I want to find out for myself if I like it. I haven't heard anybody say I hate it, but I have heard a lot of people just not be as impressed as some of his other work. But it was available. So, 1989, La Mesa, Texas, a small West Texas town driven by oil and cotton, and a place where everyone knows everyone else's business. So it goes for Tolly Driver, a good kid with more potential than application, 17, and about to be cursed to kill for revenge. Here, Stephen Graham Jones explores the Texas he grew up in and shared sense of unfairness of being on the outside through the slasher horror Jones loves, but the perspective of the killer Tolly, writing his own autobiography. Find yourself rooting for a killer in this summer teen movie of a novel gone full blood curdling tragic. It sounds fun. After those 2 books, which will probably be like hard, I need something that's fun. So the idea is that I'll read that as well. I'm waiting on by Stephen Graham Jones, Night of the Mannequins, which should be available soon. And that's the novella that's about only 3 hours long. So I'm going to fit that one in as well. I'm learning I gotta fit in novellas where I can. Because My Heart is a Chainsaw isn't available for like 6 more weeks, and that's a 12-hour read. So, and that's a little bit on the longer side for me to try and knock out in a short amount of time. So yeah, that's my official TBR. Bad Cree by Jessica Johns, Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead, and Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones, Green Fuse Burning by Tiffany Morris, and Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. That is my main TBR that I'm trying to knock out for this month of November. Again, Bad Cree is off to a fine start. I'm really excited to get into And Then She Fell, and Johnny Appleseed. Those are my 2 possibly 5 stars for the month, and I'm very, very excited to knock those out. I also have, and I don't think it's gonna happen, me getting to them this month, to be honest, We Sold Our Souls by Grady Hendrix. That is the last Grady Hendrix that I have to read, and then I would have read all of his books before the next one comes out, which I think is about, it's like witches, wayward witches, or something along those lines, like pregnant witches, or something amongst that. I think that's the next one that's supposed to be coming out. I'm actually a Grady Hendrix fan. I know that's some people hate that man, but I very much like all of the books that for the most part, all the books that he's come out with. So I just need to read We Sold Our Souls, because I found this amazing. This is the only copy that I wanted, and I ended up finding it at the thrift store, which I'm just still so excited about. The one that kind of looks like a Rolling Stones cover. And this was the one that I really, really wanted, mainly because I love, and it's got to be the designer. I love how a lot of, especially his earlier work, really fed into the kitschiness of it being something that it's not, or the book being something that represented what the book was about. So, of course, that one looked like a Rolling Stone cover. This is like the original cover, and then they came out with some like more traditional, we just have a regular cover type of books. And then Horror Store, which looks like an IKEA booklet, which I absolutely love. But yeah, that, and then I have Nat Cassidy's Nestlings. I don't know if I'm going to get to Nestlings. I'm pretty positive it's not going to be this month. I really do want to get to it before the end of the year. I feel like Nestlings is a wintry novel, so I want to read it during December. I'm not really into holiday horror. So, other than the possibility of reading Krampus by Brom, which I don't know, now reading Slewfoot, I think it may be too traditional for me, and I'm not sure if I'm going to really love it. December is kind of gonna end up being like a mad dash of just me reading whatever I feel like mood reading. That at the moment is probably Rest Stop by Nat Cassidy. I'm going to try and read that while I'm on the plane for my Thanksgiving trip back home. Bloom. I still have to read Bloom. I really want to knock out all of the novellas that I have just to kind of have some layups towards my goal. And then, you know, I have Brat that's currently waiting for me to be read. It's on Libby right now, and I think it lets go in about 4 weeks. So I'm preparing for that to let go. Actually, I even have Venko by Cherie Demeline, and I also found this at the thrift store. I actually am probably going to make this a possible read during this month, considering the the author is Indigenous. So we'll see where that one's sitting on Libby and see if, you know, how quickly I'm moving through the stories, if I end up being able to possibly read that, especially waiting for maybe some Stephen Graham Jones to let out. I have so many other books that I have still waiting on my TBR, so there are plenty of choices. It's really time. What's available on Libby for audiobooks and time. So I'm excited though. I'm excited for this month's TBR. Again, Bad Cree is off to a pretty good start, and the Johnny Appleseed and Then She Fell sound amazing. So here's to hopefully those being really, really great, and I just knock through them real easy, because as the holidays gear up, less and less time is available. And I'm just trying to get to the end. I'm just trying to get to my goal. If I can hit probably 60 though, I'll feel really good about myself, because that's still more, and significantly more, than I read last year. Last year I read 52 books. So that would still be over. It would still be a good amount. 60 books in a year for me, going from when I first started reading and counting, I was like 38 books. I read 38 books. And then the following year, yeah, I read 52 last year, which was pretty amazing for me to go from like not reading at all to reading that many. So slow progress is where we're aiming for this end of the year. That is the ongoing mantra. I hope that y'all enjoyed today's video. Please give me a like if you like today's video, and please subscribe if you're looking forward to any of the conversations around any of the books that I am currently on my way to finishing. Hopefully. Again, there's tons of, I can't say this enough during all of my book videos, there's tons of holiday and decor videos on my channel right now, just because of the holidays being right now. But I cannot say enough that during the rest of the year, I am mainly focused on a lot of books on my channel. So if you like today's video, please subscribe, because especially once we get into the new year, it is mainly a booktube around here. So I hope that you liked today's video, and I will see y'all in the next one. Bye!